The USS Sablefish glided through the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, its sleek black hull cutting silently beneath the waves. Inside the submarine, Commander George Warren stood in the control room, scanning the encrypted orders that had just come in from Naval Command. His face was a mask of concentration, though his eyes betrayed the weight of the message. "Greenland Rise," he muttered, almost to himself. Lieutenant Ellen Hughes, his executive officer, looked up from her station. "Something about this mission bothering you, sir?" Warren folded the paper neatly and slid it into the pocket of his uniform. "Unusual parameters, that's all. We're tasked with investigating seismic anomalies and acoustic disturbances in a region with little prior mapping. Command wants detailed intel." Hughes raised an eyebrow. "Seismic anomalies? Are we surveying or looking for something specific?" "Doesn't say," Warren replied curtly. "Just that the activity has been classified as significant. Prep the crew for deep-sea operations. We'll descend at 2,200 hours. The Sablefish was no stranger to deep-water missions. Built to withstand the immense pressures of the ocean's depths, it carried state-of-the-art sonar, communications, and navigation systems. Yet, for all its technological advancements, the crew relied just as heavily on their wits and instincts, traits honed through grueling training and years of experience. As the submarine moved closer to the Greenland Rise, the atmosphere aboard began to shift. Rumors spread quickly in the confined quarters of the vessel. Some of the younger sailors whispered about the region's sinister nickname, the Devil's Gutter. Tales of ghost ships, unexplained disappearances, and strange noises from the abyss had been passed down through generations of mariners. In the mess hall, Chief Petty Officer Morales leaned against the counter, watching Seaman Anthony Decker fiddle nervously with his coffee cup. "Let me guess," Morales said, his gruff voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "You've been listening to those old sea stories." Decker shrugged. "They're not just stories, Chief. I looked up the reports before we left base. This area's been flagged for magnetic anomalies and unexplained acoustic readings for decades." Morales smirked. "And what? You think we're gonna run into the Kraken?" Decker's expression darkened. "What about the trawler they found 2 years ago? The one with the hull torn open like a tin can? They said it happened near here." "Listen, kid," Morales said, leaning in. "Every patch of ocean has its mysteries. Doesn't mean there's anything down there but rock and water." But even Morales couldn't completely dismiss the unease that crept into the back of his mind. He'd spent over 2 decades aboard submarines and knew the ocean was as unpredictable as it was vast. At 2,200 hours, the Sablefish began its descent. The control room was a hive of activity as the crew worked to ensure a smooth operation. "Depth at 3,000 meters, Hughes reported, her voice steady despite the tension that hung in the air. "Sonar status?" Warren asked. "Operational," replied sonar technician First Class Carter. He adjusted the controls, his eyes narrowing as he studied the screen. "Picking up faint seismic activity below us, but it's localized. Could be a minor fault line." "Keep monitoring," Warren said. The submarine descended further, its hull creaking softly under the increasing pressure. The lights flickered briefly, a common enough occurrence at these depths, but it still sent a ripple of unease through the crew. "Commander," Carter said suddenly, his voice tinged with confusion. "There's something else. Low-frequency sound waves, rhythmic, almost like," he hesitated, searching for the right word. "Almost like what?" Warren pressed. "A heartbeat," Carter said finally. The control room fell silent. "Could be interference," Hughes suggested, though her tone was uncertain. "Log it," Warren ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "Maintain course. Let's not jump to conclusions." But as the Sablefish ventured deeper, the rhythmic pulse persisted, growing louder and more distinct. In the cramped corridors and dimly lit compartments of the submarine, a sense of unease began to take hold. Below deck, in the engineering bay, Decker worked alongside Morales to secure the systems for the increasing depth. "You feel that?" Decker asked suddenly. "Feel what?" Morales replied without looking up. "It's like a vibration," Decker said, his voice barely audible. Morales paused, placing a hand against the bulkhead. For a moment, he felt it too, a faint, almost imperceptible thrum that seemed to resonate through the metal. "It's just the engines," Morales said, though his own voice wavered slightly. Deep in the heart of the Greenland Rise, the Sablefish continued its descent, unaware that the ocean around it was alive with ancient whispers. The USS Sablefish descended deeper into the Greenland Rise, the temperature gauges marking the sharp drop in water temperature as the submarine pushed past 4,000 meters. The hum of the reactor and the faint groans of the hull under pressure filled the silence. For the seasoned crew, these sounds were a familiar backdrop, but this time, they carried an edge of unease. "Depth at 4,200 meters, Hughes reported. She sat rigid at her station, her fingers flying over the controls with practiced precision. Commander Warren nodded, standing tall in the control room, his eyes locked on the monitors. "Status on the anomaly?" Sonar technician Carter tapped his screen, his brow furrowed. "Still picking up those low-frequency sound waves, sir. They're consistent. Rhythmic. Almost biological." "Biological?" Warren repeated, his tone skeptical. Carter hesitated. "It's hard to explain, sir. It doesn't match anything in the database. The closest comparison would be echolocation, but on a scale I've never seen." Warren leaned over the console, studying the strange waveform. The pulse had a hypnotic quality, steady and unyielding. "Could be a geological phenomenon," Hughes offered, though she didn't sound convinced. "Or something else entirely," Warren muttered. He straightened up and barked his next command. "Maintain course. Reduce speed to 1/3. I want everyone alert." In the cramped quarters of the submarine, the tension was palpable. The mess hall, usually filled with laughter and conversation during off hours, had grown eerily quiet. Decker sat at a corner table, poking at his food with a fork. Across from him, Seaman Kelly stared into her coffee, the dark liquid rippling slightly as the vessel vibrated. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Kelly said, her voice barely audible. Decker glanced up, his face pale. "You don't feel it?" "Feel what?" "The vibrations. They're off." He lowered his voice. "And the sound. I swear, it's not just on the sonar. You can almost hear it, faint, like it's in the walls." Kelly shivered but forced a smile. "You've been listening to too many stories. There's nothing out there." Decker didn't respond. Instead, he stared at the overhead lights, which flickered momentarily before stabilizing. In the engineering bay, Chief Morales ran diagnostics on the reactor systems, muttering curses under his breath as another error message flashed across his screen. "Third system glitch today," he growled. "Decker. Get over here and check the coolant valves." Decker scrambled into the bay, his face still pale. "On it, Chief." As Decker crouched to inspect the valves, he froze. There it was again, that faint vibration, like a low hum reverberating through the metal. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Morales shot him an annoyed look. "Hear what?" "That sound," Decker insisted. "Like a hum." Morales sighed and pressed his hand against the bulkhead. He frowned. There was something, a faint, rhythmic vibration, steady and persistent. "Probably just the engines," he muttered, though doubt crept into his voice. "Focus on your work." By the third watch, the anomalies began to intensify. In the control room, the sonar displays flickered with static as Carter tried to maintain a clear reading. "Commander, we've got interference across all systems," he reported. "Sonar, navigation, even comms are taking a hit." "Source?" Warren asked sharply. "Could be the magnetic field," Carter replied. "But the strength, it's off the charts. I've never seen anything like it." "Maintain course," Warren ordered. "We're close to the anomaly's epicenter. I want eyes on whatever's causing this." Hughes nodded, though her hands hovered nervously over the controls. "Commander, I recommend caution. If the magnetic field is affecting our systems, we could lose power entirely." "Noted," Warren said. "But we have our orders." As the submarine approached 5,000 meters, the faint sound that had haunted the crew grew louder. It wasn't just in the sonar anymore, it seemed to resonate through the entire vessel, a low, throbbing pulse that set teeth on edge. In the crew quarters, Seaman McCall woke with a start, his heart pounding. The dream had been vivid, dark shapes moving through the water, eyes that glowed like burning coals, and a voice, low and guttural, calling his name. He sat up, gasping for breath. Around him, the other sailors stirred uneasily in their bunks. "Did you hear that?" McCall whispered to the room. No one answered, but the haunted expressions on their faces told him they had. Back in the control room, the first officer Hughes stiffened. "Sir, we've got something on sonar," she said, her voice tight. Carter nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the controls. "It's big, Commander. Really big. Stationary, about 5,300 meters down." "What is it?" Warren asked, stepping closer. "Unknown," Carter said. "But whatever it is, it's emitting a massive magnetic field." "And the sound?" "Spit it out, technician," Warren snapped. "It's getting louder, sir." The crew stared at the display, where a massive, indistinct shape loomed in the depths. The rhythmic pulse echoed through the submarine, faster now, like the beating of a giant heart. Deep below, something ancient stirred. By the fourth day of the mission, the atmosphere aboard the Sablefish was suffocating. The rhythmic pulse, which had initially been a faint anomaly on the sonar, was now a persistent presence, resonating through the submarine like the tolling of a distant bell. Commander Warren stood at the center of the control room, his usually calm demeanor strained. The crew's unease had become palpable. Conversations were clipped, footsteps hurried, and even the seasoned officers seemed tense. "Status on the anomaly?" Warren asked, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Still stationary," Carter reported, his eyes glued to the sonar screen. "It hasn't moved, but the magnetic interference is worse. We're losing calibration on almost all systems. Can we stabilize?" "I'm trying, sir," Hughes interjected. "But if the interference increases, we're at risk of losing propulsion entirely." Warren nodded, his jaw tightening. "Keep us steady. I want to maintain visual confirmation. If we can't get a clear picture, we'll use the drone." "Yes, sir," Hughes replied, though the tension in her voice was unmistakable. Below deck, the situation was no better. The hum that resonated through the Sablefish had taken on an almost hypnotic quality, lulling some crew members into uneasy states of semi-consciousness. Others reported vivid, unsettling dreams. Decker was in the mess hall when it happened. He was sipping coffee, trying to shake off the fatigue that had gripped him for days. Across the room, McCall sat alone, his head in his hands. "You okay?" Decker asked, approaching cautiously. McCall looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Can't sleep," he muttered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it." "See what?" "Something in the dark," McCall whispered. "It's like it's watching me. Watching all of us." Before Decker could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for several heart-pounding seconds. When they came back on, McCall was gone. "McCall!" Decker called out, his voice echoing in the empty mess hall. He spun around, his pulse hammering in his ears, but there was no sign of the other sailor. In the engineering bay, Chief Morales was conducting a routine inspection when he noticed something strange. A series of deep, jagged scratches marred the metal wall near the coolant valves. "What the hell?" he muttered, running his fingers over the gouges. They were unlike anything he'd seen before, too precise to be accidental but too chaotic to be mechanical. He was about to call for assistance when a noise stopped him cold, a faint whisper, low and indistinct, coming from the ventilation shaft above. "Who's there?" Morales barked, his voice firm despite the chill creeping up his spine. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Morales stared at the vent for a long moment before shaking his head. "Get it together, old man," he muttered, turning back to his work. But the scratches lingered in his mind, and as he moved through the bay, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By evening, the tension reached a breaking point. Another crew member had vanished, this time, Senior Technician Roger Hale. He'd last been seen in the control room, but when a search party scoured the submarine, they found no trace of him. "Two men don't just disappear," Warren said, slamming his hand on the table in the briefing room. "They're not just disappearing," Hughes replied, her voice trembling. "Something's taking them." Warren looked at her sharply. "You're jumping to conclusions." "Am I?" she shot back. "The scratches on the walls, the noises in the vents, the dreams, this isn't coincidence, Commander. Something is happening to us." Before Warren could respond, the intercom crackled to life. "Commander Warren to the control room. Priority 1, Carter's voice came through, strained and panicked. The control room was chaos when Warren and Hughes arrived. The sonar display flickered wildly, the rhythmic pulse now deafening through the speakers. "What's going on?" Warren demanded. Carter turned, his face pale. "It moved, sir." "What moved?" "The anomaly," Carter replied. "It's no longer stationary. It's rising." The room fell silent as everyone stared at the screen. The massive shape that had loomed at 5,300 meters was now ascending, slowly but deliberately. "How fast?" Warren asked, his voice tight. "Not fast," Carter said. "But it's coming straight for us." Warren clenched his fists. "Full reverse. Get us out of here." "Sir, propulsion's compromised," Hughes said, her voice cracking. "The magnetic interference, it's too strong. We're barely holding position." The rhythmic pulse grew louder, rattling through the submarine like the drumbeat of an approaching storm. Lights flickered, and the temperature in the control room seemed to drop. And then, for the first time, they heard it, a sound that wasn't just a pulse but a voice. Deep, resonant, and inhuman, it echoed through the hull, speaking in a language no one could understand but everyone instinctively feared. "It's alive," Carter whispered, his face ashen. Deep below the surface, the ocean's ancient secret was waking. The USS Sablefish quivered under the weight of an unseen force as the anomaly ascended. The rhythmic pulse had transformed into an all-encompassing presence, its vibrations rattling through the hull and into the bones of the crew. Commander Warren gripped the edge of the control console, his knuckles white. "Damage report," he barked. Hughes scanned her screen, her voice tense. "Minimal structural damage so far, but the interference is destabilizing our systems. Propulsion's at 20%, and the reactor is running hot. Coolant valves are holding," Morales added over the intercom from the engineering bay. "But if we lose power completely, we're dead in the water." "Noted," Warren replied, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Keep those systems stable." Carter, update on the anomaly. It's huge," sir, Carter stammered, pointing to the sonar display. It's less than a kilometer below us now. The readings, it's emitting some kind of energy field. Magnetic, thermal, maybe biological. Biological? Warren repeated, his brow furrowing. Carter nodded grimly. I can't explain it, sir, but it's unlike anything I've ever seen. And the sound, it's getting louder. The low, guttural voice echoed through the submarine again, its tones alien yet almost intelligible, like a primal language that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. Below deck. In the crew quarters, panic began to spread. The once disciplined sailors were now on edge, muttering among themselves about the voices and the vanishing crew members. Decker sat on his bunk, staring blankly at the wall as Kelly paced nearby. This isn't natural, Kelly said, her voice shaking. People don't just disappear, Decker. And that noise, it's not a machine, it's not geological. It's alive. Shut up, Decker whispered, his hands trembling. What? I said, shut up. Decker snapped, his voice rising. He stood abruptly, his eyes wide with fear. Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I don't hear it? Every time I close my eyes, I see. He stopped, choking on his words. Kelly stepped back, her own fear mirrored in his face. Before either could speak again, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. A deep, resonant thrum filled the air, growing louder and louder until it felt like the submarine itself was vibrating apart. And then, silence. When the lights returned, Kelly was alone. Decker was gone. The control room. Sir, we've lost another one, Hughes reported, her voice grim. Warren's jaw tightened. Who? Decker, she replied. Last seen in the crew quarters. The weight of the missing crew hung heavy in the room. Warren slammed his fist on the console. We can't lose anyone else. I don't care what it takes, get us out of this hellhole. Hughes hesitated, then spoke carefully. Sir, we need to face the possibility that whatever this is, it's targeting us. The disappearances, the voices, it's deliberate. What are you suggesting? Warren asked, his voice sharp. That this isn't just an anomaly, Hughes said. It's intelligent. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Engineering Bay. Chief Morales wiped sweat from his brow as he monitored the reactor's temperature. The gauges flickered erratically, the magnetic interference wreaking havoc on the system. Morales, came Warren's voice over the intercom. Status report. We're holding, but barely, Morales replied. The interference is making it damn near impossible to keep the reactor stable. And there's something else. What is it? Morales hesitated. I don't know how to explain this, sir, but there's movement. Inside the walls. Inside the walls. Warren repeated. Yes, Morales said. It's faint, but it's there. Like something's crawling through the ventilation shafts. Stay on high alert, Warren ordered. Don't have to tell me twice, Morales muttered, glancing warily at the vents. As he turned back to the controls, a sudden clang echoed through the bay. Morales spun around, his heart racing. Who's there? He called out. Silence. The clang came again, louder this time, followed by a series of faint, skittering noises. Morales grabbed a wrench from the workbench and approached the source of the sound, a vent covered near the far wall. He knelt down, gripping the wrench tightly as he peered into the dark, narrow opening. For a moment, there was nothing but shadow. And then, something moved. A flash of pale, slick flesh, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent Morales scrambling backward. The control room. Sir, we're getting anomalous readings in the engineering bay, Hughes reported. Define anomalous, Warren said. Hughes hesitated. Thermal signatures. Multiple. They're moving. Warren stared at her, his stomach sinking. Seal the engineering bay, he ordered. But Morales. Seal it. Warren snapped. Hughes hesitated for only a second before locking the bulkheads. The faint sound of Morales's panicked voice came through the intercom before it was abruptly cut off. What the hell is happening to us? Hughes whispered. The submarine groaned under the weight of the anomaly's presence, and the voice returned, louder than ever, echoing through the hull like the pronouncement of a god. Deep below, the ancient entity continued its ascent, its purpose as unfathomable as the depths themselves. The USS Sablefish was no longer just a vessel, it had become a prison. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on the remaining crew as they struggled to make sense of the growing chaos. The lights flickered more frequently now, and the rhythmic pulse had evolved into something else, an unrelenting beat that seemed to pierce straight into their minds. Commander Warren stood in the control room, his eyes fixed on the sonar display. The anomaly was no longer a static presence beneath them, it was moving, and with purpose. Distance, he barked. Less than 800 meters and closing, Carter replied, his voice trembling. It's rising faster, sir. Hughes turned from her station, her face pale. We need to surface, Commander. If it breaches the hull. Do you think I don't know that? Warren snapped, then softened his tone. We're doing everything we can. Hughes, focus on stabilizing propulsion. Carter, keep me updated on its trajectory. The crew worked frantically, but the strain of the situation was beginning to show. Whispers of the missing crew members circulated like a contagion, and everyone seemed to feel the invisible eyes that watched them from every shadowed corner. In the galley. The once bustling mess hall was eerily quiet. Only a handful of sailors sat at the tables, picking at their meals with little appetite. The silence was broken only by the occasional clatter of cutlery or the faint hum of the submarine systems. Seaman Kelly sat alone, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She could still hear the whispers from the night before, faint and insistent, calling her name from the vents. Kelly. She froze. The voice was clear this time, unmistakable. Slowly, she turned toward the source, a dark corner of the galley where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally. Kelly, the voice repeated, low and guttural. Her breath quickened as she stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The other sailors looked up, startled. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice shaking. Hear what? One of them replied, frowning. But before she could answer, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. Screams echoed through the galley as something unseen moved among them, the sound of rushing air and clawing metal drowning out the terrified cries. When the lights returned, Kelly was gone. Engineering bay. The engineering bay was sealed, but it was far from silent. Inside, the metallic groans of the submarine's hull were interspersed with other noises, scratches, thuds, and faint, inhuman whispers that echoed through the vents. Chief Morales, now alone, worked feverishly to stabilize the reactor. His breathing was labored, and his hands trembled as he adjusted the controls. Come on, baby, he muttered. Hold together for me. A sudden noise behind him made him whirl around, the wrench in his hand raised defensively. The vent cover he had seen before was ajar, hanging loosely by a single screw. Stay back. Morales shouted, though there was no one there. The skittering noises returned, louder now, coming from the walls themselves. Morales backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. From the shadows, a shape emerged. Pale and glistening, it moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form shifting as it stepped closer. Morales froze, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Before he could scream, the lights flickered, and the creature lunged. The control room. Commander, "We've lost contact with engineering," Hughes said, her voice tight with fear. Warren clenched his fists. "What do you mean, lost contact?" "No response from Morales," she replied. "Thermal sensors are still picking up movement, but—" "Enough," Warren interrupted. "Seal off the engineering bay and redirect power to propulsion. We're getting out of here now." "But sir—" "I gave you an order, Lieutenant." Warren barked. Hughes hesitated, then nodded, her fingers flying over the controls. The sound of the bulkheads locking echoed through the submarine, a grim reminder of their growing isolation. The rising threat. On the sonar display, the anomaly was now only 500 meters below the submarine. Its shape was more distinct, an immense mass that defied classification. It pulsed with a sickly light, its rhythmic beat resonating through the ship with a power that seemed almost alive. "What the hell is that thing?" Carter whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "Focus, technician," Warren said, though his own voice was strained. "It's too big, sir," Carter continued. "If it gets any closer—" "We won't let it," Warren said firmly. The submarine's engines roared to life as the Sablefish began to ascend, its damaged systems straining against the pull of the anomaly's magnetic field. But even as they climbed, the pulse grew louder, more insistent. The lights dimmed, and the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the very pressure of the deep was seeping into the submarine. And then, the voice returned. It was clearer now, a guttural, resonant tone that seemed to echo not just through the hull, but inside their minds. "You cannot run," it said. The words were alien and yet unmistakable, spoken in a language that defied understanding but carried a terrible clarity. The crew stared at each other in horror as the submarine groaned under the strain of the anomaly's presence. "Keep us moving," Warren ordered, his voice shaking. "We're getting out of here." But deep down, he knew the truth, the Sablefish was no longer in control. Far below, the ancient entity continued its relentless ascent, its purpose unfathomable and its power undeniable. The USS Sablefish climbed steadily, its engines straining against the immense forces pulling it toward the anomaly. The once reliable vessel now seemed fragile, as if its very structure was buckling under the weight of something beyond comprehension. Commander Warren stood at the center of the control room, his voice commanding but his face betraying his inner turmoil. "Depth?" he asked. "Rising steadily, sir," Hughes replied, her fingers trembling over the controls. "We're at 3,800 meters, but propulsion is struggling. If we push the engines any harder, we risk a meltdown." "Then we'll risk it," Warren said firmly. "We can't stay here." Sonar technician Carter glanced up from his station, his face pale. "Commander, it's still following us. Closing fast. Less than 400 meters below now." "Damn it," Warren muttered under his breath. "Can we launch the drone? Maybe get a visual?" Hughes hesitated. "We've lost most auxiliary power to the interference." "I can try rerouting." "Do it," Warren interrupted. As Hughes worked, the voice returned, reverberating through the submarine. "You cannot escape," it said, low and resonant, the words crawling into their minds like icy fingers. The crew froze. Some instinctively covered their ears, though the sound seemed to bypass all barriers, echoing directly within their thoughts. "Is it talking to us?" Carter whispered. "Focus on your station." Warren barked, though his voice was tight with fear. Below deck. In the crew quarters, chaos had taken hold. The remaining sailors huddled together, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. The whispers that had plagued them earlier had grown louder, now unmistakable and persistent. "It's picking us off, one by one," a sailor murmured, his voice trembling. "Shut up," another snapped. "We'll get out of this. We have to." But even as the words were spoken, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. In that brief span, one of the sailors screamed, a sound cut short with chilling abruptness. When the lights returned, the sailor was gone, leaving behind only a smear of blood on the wall. Panic erupted. The men shouted and scrambled, their fear devolving into primal terror. "Something's in here," one of them screamed. "We're not safe anywhere." Engineering Bay. The sealed engineering bay was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the reactor. But beyond the bulkheads, the walls were alive with noise, scratches, whispers, and the occasional deep, resonant thud that sent vibrations through the submarine. Whatever had claimed Morales was still there, moving unseen but always present. The drone launch. In the control room, Hughes let out a shaky breath as she activated the external drone. The screen flickered, and for a moment, static filled the monitor. Then, the feed stabilized, revealing the darkness beyond the submarine's hull. "Drone deployed," Hughes reported. Switching to visual. The camera panned slowly through the inky blackness, its lights illuminating the void. At first, there was nothing, just the endless expanse of deep ocean. Then, the image shifted. Something massive loomed in the darkness, its edges indistinct but pulsating with a sickly, bioluminescent glow. It was impossible to discern its full shape, the entity seemed to shift and ripple, as though it was both there and not there at the same time. "What in God's name?" Hughes whispered. The crew stared in stunned silence as the drone's camera zoomed closer. The entity's surface was a chaotic mosaic of textures, flesh, scales, and something metallic, all moving as one. And then, it turned. A massive, glowing eye filled the screen, its pupil contracting as if focusing on the drone. The rhythmic pulse grew louder, shaking the control room, and the voice returned, more powerful than ever. "You are intruders. You awaken what should not be disturbed." The screen went dark as the drone feed cut out. "The entity attacks. Propulsion's failing," Hughes shouted as the submarine lurched violently. The lights dimmed, and an eerie, metallic groan echoed through the vessel as if the ocean itself was bearing down on it. "It's pulling us back," Carter yelled, his hands gripping the console. "Evasive maneuvers," Warren ordered. Hughes tried to comply, but the controls were sluggish, responding with agonizing slowness. "The interference is too strong. We're losing control." The submarine tilted sharply, throwing the crew off balance. Alarms blared as water began to seep through a hairline crack in one of the bulkheads. "We can't hold this depth," Hughes shouted. "The hull won't survive much longer." Warren's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to push the submarine to its limits. But deep down, he knew they were outmatched. "Carter, status on the entity?" "It's right beneath us," Carter replied, his voice rising in panic. It's opening something. Some kind of vortex." Through the sonar, the crew could hear it, a low, resonant roar, accompanied by a deep, rhythmic thrum that seemed to shake the very ocean. The final moments. The Sablefish groaned under the strain as the vortex began to form. The water around the submarine churned violently, pulling it toward the entity's massive form. "Full power to propulsion," Warren shouted. "We need to break free." "It's not enough," Hughes cried. "We can't escape this." The submarine systems began to fail one by one. Lights flickered and died, the reactor sputtered, and the hull creaked ominously as the pressure mounted. And then, the voice came again, deep and final. "Join the others. Become part of the abyss." The last thing Commander Warren saw was the glowing eye of the entity, impossibly vast and filled with an ancient, unknowable malice, before the Sablefish was pulled into the vortex and consumed by the darkness. The USS Sablefish spiraled into darkness, its reinforced hull groaning under the immense forces pulling it downward. Inside, chaos reigned. Crew members were flung against walls and bulkheads as the submarine bucked and twisted like a ragdoll caught in a tempest. "Brace for impact!" Commander Warren shouted over the deafening roar of alarms and groaning metal. But there was no impact. Instead, the Sablefish was dragged deeper into a swirling maelstrom of water and light. The vortex surrounding the submarine shimmered with an unnatural glow, casting eerie patterns on the walls. The rhythmic pulse was deafening now, vibrating through every surface and into the very marrow of their bones. In the control room, Lieutenant Hughes struggled to maintain control of the submarine. "We've lost propulsion completely," she cried. "We're not in freefall, we're being pulled." Warren gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. "By what?" "The entity," sonar technician Carter said, his voice hollow. It's all around us. The vortex, the light, it's coming from it." "Depth?" Warren demanded. Carter shook his head. "Instruments are useless, sir. We've passed crush depth. We shouldn't even be alive right now." The realization struck Warren like a hammer: they were no longer bound by the natural laws of the ocean. Whatever this entity was, it defied everything they understood about physics and reality itself. The hallucinations begin. As the submarine descended further, the crew began to experience strange phenomena. In the crew quarters, the remaining sailors huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. The walls around them seemed to pulse with life, their surfaces shifting and writhing like living tissue. "Do you see that?" whispered Seaman Kelly, her voice trembling. The others nodded, their faces pale. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room, taking on vague, humanoid shapes before dissolving into the darkness. "Are we losing our minds?" one of them asked. Before anyone could answer, the whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder and more insistent. They weren't random sounds, they were voices, speaking directly into their thoughts. "Come closer," the voices said. "We have waited for you." Kelly clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head, pulling at her thoughts like strings on a puppet. "I can't take this," she muttered, standing abruptly. "I have to get out of here." "Kelly, wait," one of the others called, but it was too late. She darted out of the room, disappearing into the dimly lit corridors of the submarine. In the engineering bay. The engineering bay was a nightmare of flickering lights and failing systems. The sealed bulkheads offered little protection against the growing presence of the entity, which seemed to seep into every corner of the vessel. Chief Morales's tools lay scattered on the floor, abandoned in the chaos. The faint, rhythmic tapping that had plagued the bay earlier had grown louder, echoing through the ventilation shafts. And then, the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the room, shaking the walls. The bulkhead began to bulge inward, as though an immense pressure was being applied from the other side. Suddenly, the metal gave way with a deafening screech. Something massive and formless slithered into the bay, its pale, slick surface glistening in the dim light. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its shifting form defying all logic. Morales's last scream was cut short as the creature enveloped him, leaving nothing behind. The entity revealed. In the control room, the sonar displays had gone dark, and the cameras showed only static. But the crew didn't need instruments to know the entity was near, they could feel it. The rhythmic pulse was no longer just a sound, it was a force, pressing down on them from all sides. "Commander," Hughes said, her voice trembling. "We're not in the ocean anymore." Warren frowned. "What are you talking about?" She gestured to the external cameras, which had briefly flickered back to life. The view outside the submarine was no longer that of deep water. Instead, they were surrounded by an endless void, punctuated by faint, shifting lights. "It's like a different dimension," Hughes said, her voice barely audible. Before Warren could respond, the voice of the entity returned, louder and more resonant than ever. You have entered the abyss. Your kind was never meant to be here. The lights in the control room dimmed, and a shadow began to coalesce in the center of the room. It grew larger and darker, its edges shimmering with an otherworldly energy. Carter backed away, his face pale. It's here. The shadow solidified into a shape, vaguely humanoid, but impossibly large and grotesque. Its form seemed to shift constantly, as though it was made of liquid darkness. You awaken what should not be disturbed, the entity said, its voice echoing in their minds. Now, you will join the others. Warren stepped forward, his fear replaced by a desperate resolve. Why us? He demanded. What do you want? The entity tilted its head, as if amused. You are vessels, like those before you. Flesh, thought, and will. But here, in the abyss, you are nothing. The crew stared in horror as the shadow began to spread, consuming the control room inch by inch. Sir, Hughes said, her voice shaking. We have to do something. Warren nodded, his mind racing. We're not giving up. Not yet. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. The USS Sablefish was no longer a submarine navigating the depths of the ocean. It had become a drifting speck in an infinite void, surrounded by darkness that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. The entity's voice reverberated through every corner of the vessel, its haunting words twisting into the minds of the remaining crew. In the control room, Commander Warren stood frozen as the shadowy figure loomed before them, its form constantly shifting, as though the abyss itself had taken shape. The crew scrambled for answers, but the instruments were dead, and their options were dwindling. What do you want from us? Warren demanded, his voice trembling but defiant. The entity's glowing eyes flickered, twin orbs of otherworldly light that seemed to pierce straight through him. You are intruders, it replied, its voice layered with tones both guttural and melodic. Your kind disturbs what was meant to remain undisturbed. You bring noise into the silence, chaos into the stillness. Hughes stepped forward cautiously, her voice shaking. We didn't mean to. Silence, the entity commanded, and the word hit them like a physical blow. Hughes staggered back, clutching her head as the voice filled her mind with unbearable pressure. The crew splinters. Below deck, the remaining sailors huddled in the dark, their fear driving them to the edge of madness. The walls pulsed with a faint, sickly glow, and the rhythmic pulse had become an almost physical force, vibrating through their bodies. We're all gonna die here, one of them whispered, his voice cracking. Shut up, another snapped. We need to keep it together. But it was too late. The whispers had returned, louder now, and more insistent. Each sailor heard their own name being called, the voices eerily familiar yet wrong, as though spoken by a distorted version of someone they once knew. Don't you hear it? Kelly asked, her wide eyes darting to the others. It's in our heads. It knows who we are. What are you talking about? It's calling us, she said, her voice rising. It knows everything about us, our fears, our thoughts, our memories. It's inside us. Before anyone could stop her, Kelly bolted for the hatch. She threw it open and disappeared into the dim corridors, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The entity speaks. In the control room, the entity's voice grew louder, its tone shifting from a low rumble to an almost soothing melody. Your vessel is broken. Your bodies are frail. Yet your minds, it paused, as if savoring the thought. Your minds are open doors. What the hell does that mean? Carter whispered, backing away from the shadowy figure. It's feeding on us, Hughes said, her voice trembling. Our thoughts, our memories, everything we are. That's what it wants. Warren clenched his fists, his mind racing. If the entity was truly feeding on their thoughts, then every moment they spent here only made them more vulnerable. Enough, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. If you're so powerful, why not just kill us? Why keep us alive? The entity tilted its head, as though considering the question. Life is fleeting, it said. But fear endures. And in your fear, I grow. Descent into madness. As the entity's presence grew stronger, the remaining systems aboard the submarine began to fail entirely. The lights flickered, then died, leaving the crew in near total darkness. The air grew heavy, each breath a struggle as the oppressive weight of the abyss pressed down on them. Warren moved through the control room, his flashlight cutting weak beams through the shadows. We need a plan, he said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. Hughes, can we still access the reactor? Hughes hesitated. The engineering bay is sealed. But if we can get to the auxiliary controls, we might be able to overload the core. That would kill us all, Carter said, his voice panicked. We're already dead if we stay here, Warren shot back. If we overload the reactor, we might create enough of an explosion to break free from whatever this is. Hughes nodded reluctantly. It's a long shot, but it's better than doing nothing. A dangerous journey. The remaining crew gathered what equipment they could and prepared to make their way to the auxiliary control room. The corridors were dim and eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the submarine's failing systems. As they moved, the whispers followed them, growing louder with every step. Shadows danced along the walls, and the rhythmic pulse seemed to grow closer, like a heartbeat echoing through the metal. Stay together, Warren ordered, his flashlight sweeping the darkness ahead. But the abyss had other plans. The shadows came alive, shifting and coalescing into monstrous forms. One of the sailors screamed as a dark tendril lashed out, pulling him into the void. The others opened fire, their weapons flashing in the dark, but the bullets passed through the shadows harmlessly. Run! Warren shouted. The survivors sprinted through the narrow corridors, the shadows closing in around them. Behind them, the entity's voice echoed, calm and unyielding. You cannot escape the abyss. You are already mine. The reactor plan. The remaining crew reached the auxiliary control room, slamming the hatch shut behind them. Hughes immediately went to work, her hands shaking as she accessed the reactor controls. Can we do it? Warren asked. Hughes nodded, though her face was pale. I can set the reactor to overload, but we won't have long once it starts. Maybe a minute, tops. Do it, Warren said. Carter, get ready to broadcast a distress signal. If we're going down, someone has to know what happened here. The rhythmic pulse grew louder, shaking the walls as the entity's presence closed in around them. You cannot defy me, it said, its voice filling their minds. The abyss takes all. But Warren refused to give in. Then let the abyss take this, he growled. Hughes pressed the final command, and the reactor began to hum with an ominous energy. The final countdown. The submarine shook violently as the reactor reached critical levels. The air crackled with energy, and the walls began to warp as the entity's shadowy form seeped into the room. Broadcast the signal. Warren shouted. Carter activated the emergency transmitter, his voice shaking as he spoke into the microphone. Mayday, Mayday. This is the USS Sablefish. We've encountered something. It's not human. It's... Before he could finish, the shadow engulfed him, silencing his screams. Warren and Hughes exchanged one final look as the reactor's timer hit 0. The last thing they heard was the entity's voice, calm and eternal. The abyss is forever. And then, there was light. The reactor of the USS Sablefish reached critical mass, and in an instant, the crushing darkness was obliterated by a blinding flash of light. The energy surge ripped through the submarine, tearing metal apart and flooding the void with a searing, unnatural brightness. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The abyss, once infinite and consuming, recoiled as the explosion disrupted its otherworldly equilibrium. The shadowy forms dissolved into nothingness, and the oppressive pulse of the entity faltered, its rhythm stuttering as though wounded. Commander Warren felt the floor drop away beneath him as the shockwave hurled him across the control room. His ears rang, and his vision blurred, but even through the chaos, he could feel the presence of the entity weakening. Hughes, crumpled against a console, coughed violently as the air filled with acrid smoke. "Did it work?" she gasped, forcing herself to stand. Warren dragged himself to his feet, his hands gripping a railing for support. The control room was in shambles, sparks flying from exposed wiring and shattered panels. "I don't know," he said hoarsely. "But we're still here. That's something." The aftermath. In the silence that followed the explosion, the surviving crew members emerged from the wreckage, their faces pale and eyes wide with disbelief. "What happened?" one of the sailors asked, his voice trembling. "We overloaded the reactor," Hughes replied, still coughing. "It created an energy surge strong enough to disrupt, whatever that thing was." "Is it gone?" another crew member asked, his tone desperate. Warren glanced around the room, his instinct still on edge. The entity's voice was gone, and the oppressive weight that had suffocated them seemed to have lifted. But something about the silence felt wrong, unnatural. "Don't assume anything," he said. "We need to get to the surface as quickly as possible." "Hughes, can we restore propulsion?" Hughes shook her head. "The reactor's destroyed. We're running on emergency power. At best, we can try to stabilize and float to the surface." "Do it," Warren ordered. "Every second we stay here is a second we're vulnerable." A haunting reminder. As the crew worked to stabilize the Sablefish, the submarine groaned under its own damaged weight. The walls were scorched and warped from the explosion, and many compartments were completely inaccessible. Carter, who had miraculously survived the blast, sat slumped against a bulkhead, his hands shaking. "I still hear it," he muttered. Warren knelt beside him. "Hear what?" "The pulse," Carter whispered, his eyes darting to the walls. "It's faint, but it's still there. It's waiting." Warren felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had heard nothing since the explosion, but Carter's fear was contagious. "It's gone," Warren said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Focus on getting us out of here." Carter nodded weakly but said nothing more. The return of the abyss. As the hours dragged on, the Sablefish rose slowly toward the surface. The surviving crew clung to the hope that they might escape the abyss and return to the world above. But as they ascended, strange phenomena began to re-emerge. The lights flickered intermittently, and faint, ghostly whispers echoed through the corridors. The rhythmic pulse, which they thought they had silenced, returned, soft at first but growing louder with every passing minute. In the control room, Hughes frantically worked to maintain stability. "I don't understand," she said, her voice strained. "The systems are failing again, but there's no reason why. It's like something is interfering from the outside." Warren stared at the sonar screen, which had come back online briefly before descending into static once more. "It's not over," he said grimly. Hughes looked at him, her face pale. "The entity?" Warren nodded. "We heard it, but we didn't kill it. It's still out there, and it's not going to let us leave." A final confrontation. As the submarine climbed closer to the surface, the entity's presence grew stronger. The shadows began to move again, slithering along the walls like living creatures. The pulse became deafening, shaking the entire vessel. The crew gathered in the control room, their faces etched with fear. "We're almost there," Hughes said, her voice barely audible above the din, "just a few hundred meters more." But the entity wasn't finished. Its voice returned, more powerful and resonant than ever, reverberating through the submarine like a thunderclap. You cannot escape, it said. The abyss claims all who enter. You will become part of me. The walls began to warp, the metal twisting as though under immense pressure. The lights exploded one by one, plunging the submarine into darkness. Hold on! Warren shouted as the vessel lurched violently, the floor tilting beneath their feet. Through the chaos, a single glowing eye appeared on the main screen, its gaze piercing and eternal. You will not leave, the entity said. The last sacrifice. Warren knew they had no chance of outrunning the entity. It was too powerful, too vast. But he refused to let it claim them without a fight. Open the ballast tanks, he ordered. Hughes stared at him in shock. What? That'll flood the compartments. We don't have a choice, Warren said. If we can destabilize the submarine's buoyancy, we might be able to disrupt its hold on us. It's a gamble, but it's all we've got. Hughes hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She moved to the controls and began releasing the ballast tanks, water pouring into the lower compartments. The submarine groaned and shuddered as the pressure shifted. The entity's voice grew louder, a furious roar that shook the entire vessel. You will not defy me, it thundered. The crew held on as the Sablefish began to spiral upward, the sudden instability breaking the entity's grip. The glowing eye on the screen flickered and disappeared, replaced by static. Breaking the surface. With a deafening roar, the USS Sablefish broke through the surface of the ocean, its battered hull barely holding together. The crew gasped as sunlight flooded the control room, blinding them after days of darkness. For a moment, there was only silence, the oppressive weight of the abyss replaced by the gentle lapping of waves. Did we make it? Hughes whispered, tears streaming down her face. Warren stared out at the endless ocean, his expression grim. We're alive, he said. For now. But as the crew celebrated their escape, a faint, familiar pulse echoed through the hull, a haunting reminder that the abyss was never far behind. The battered USS Sablefish floated listlessly on the surface of the North Atlantic, its once pristine hull scorched and dented. Sunlight glinted off the calm water, a stark contrast to the nightmare they had endured in the abyss below. Commander Warren stood on the bridge, his eyes scanning the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no sign of rescue or even the faintest suggestion of normalcy. We're alive, Hughes said, breaking the silence. She leaned against a console, her face pale but resolute. That's something. Warren turned to her, his expression grim. Alive, but for how long? We've lost the reactor, propulsion's gone, and we're low on supplies. We're drifting out here. Hughes hesitated. We can send out a distress signal. Someone will find us. Warren's gaze shifted to the faint scorch marks on the walls, where shadows had twisted and voices had whispered. The rhythmic pulse they thought they'd escaped still lingered, faint but insistent, like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of static. Do you hear that? Carter asked from the corner of the room. Hughes shot him a sharp look. There's nothing to hear. Carter shook his head, his hands trembling. No, it's still there. It's quiet, but it's waiting. The first night. As night fell, the ocean became an expanse of blackness, mirroring the abyss they had barely escaped. The stars overhead offered a cold, indifferent light, and the moon hung low on the horizon. In the crew quarters, the survivors tried to rest, but sleep did not come easily. Carter sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the far wall. Every so often, he'd glance toward the corners of the room, where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. Carter, Kelly whispered from across the room. He turned to face her, his face etched with exhaustion. You okay? She asked, though the answer was obvious. Carter shook his head. I can't stop hearing it, he murmured. It's faint now, but it's inside me. I think it always was. Kelly shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around herself. "We're safe now." "It's gone." Carter didn't respond. The strange phenomena return. By the second day, it became clear that the Sablefish was not entirely free of the abyss's influence. The first sign came from the navigation systems. Despite being powered down, the broken instruments flickered to life, displaying coordinates that shifted constantly. The crew dismissed it as a malfunction, until the coordinates began forming patterns. "It's trying to show us something," Hughes said, her voice tinged with unease. "What could it possibly want now?" Warren muttered. Later, in the galley, Kelly and another sailor discovered something even more unsettling: condensation on the walls forming shapes. At first, they were simple streaks of moisture, but as the hours passed, they began to resemble symbols, twisting, alien glyphs that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. "Commander, you need to see this," Kelly said, pulling Warren into the room. He stared at the symbols, his chest tightening. "Is this some kind of trick?" "No one's touched them," Kelly insisted. "They're just appearing." The symbols seemed to shift as Warren watched, their meaning just out of reach, like a forgotten word on the tip of his tongue. "Don't look at them too long," Hughes warned. "We don't know what they're doing to us." A message from the abyss. That night, the pulse grew louder. It was no longer just a faint noise in the background, it was in the walls, the floor, and their very minds. Warren was in the control room, staring out at the dark ocean, when the intercom crackled to life. "Commander," Hughes's voice came through, urgent and strained. "You need to get to the galley. Now." Warren rushed to the galley, his heart pounding. When he arrived, he found the remaining crew standing in a tight circle, staring at the far wall. "It's happening again," Kelly whispered. The condensation had formed new shapes, this time, unmistakably words. They were in English, scrawled in wet, glistening streaks. "You cannot escape." The crew stood in stunned silence, the words seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. Carter took a step forward, his breathing ragged. "It's still here," he whispered. "It followed us." "Enough." Warren barked, his voice cutting through the tension. "Whatever this is, it's trying to break us. We're not going to let it." "But what if it's right?" Kelly asked, her voice trembling. "What if we can't escape?" "We're alive," Warren said firmly. "And as long as we're alive, we fight. Do you understand me?" The crew nodded reluctantly, but the fear in their eyes remained. The abyss strikes again. As the hours passed, the situation aboard the Sablefish deteriorated. More symbols appeared, not just in the galley but throughout the submarine. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, and shadows began to move on their own. By dawn, another crew member was missing. "Where's Carter?" Hughes asked, her voice edged with panic. They searched the submarine, but he was nowhere to be found. In his bunk, they found only a single phrase scrawled in blood on the wall. "It knows your name." Warren felt a chill run down his spine. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." Hughes stared at him, her face pale. "We're already out, sir. We're on the surface." "Then why does it feel like we never left?" Warren muttered. A growing realization. As the sun rose over the North Atlantic, the remaining crew gathered in the control room, their faces drawn and weary. "We didn't escape," Hughes said finally, breaking the silence. "The explosion hurt it, but it didn't destroy it. The abyss is part of us now. Wherever we go, it follows." Warren clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on finding solutions, but this time, there seemed to be none. The abyss was no longer just a place they had stumbled into, it was a force, eternal and inescapable. "What do we do?" Kelly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Warren looked out at the endless ocean, his expression grim. "We survive," he said. "For as long as we can." But as the rhythmic pulse grew louder, and the shadows deepened, even he began to doubt their chances. The abyss was waiting. And it was hungry. The USS Sablefish drifted aimlessly across the North Atlantic, its once proud hull now a battered relic of the nightmare below. The crew, reduced to a handful of survivors, moved like ghosts through the corridors, their faces pale and hollow. Though they had returned to the surface, the abyss had followed them, its presence etched into every shadow and every sound. Commander Warren stood in the control room, staring at the dark water beyond the broken viewport. The rhythmic pulse was louder now, no longer just an echo in their minds but a living force that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of the submarine. "How much longer can we last?" Hughes asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Warren didn't answer immediately. He turned to face her, his expression grim. "We'll make it," he said, though even he didn't believe the words. "We lost Carter," Hughes continued, her eyes darting to the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to writhe. "And Kelly's been muttering to herself for hours. We're falling apart, sir." "We're not done yet," Warren said, his voice firm. "We've come this far. We're not giving up now." But deep down, he knew their grip on reality was slipping. The hallucinations intensify. Throughout the submarine, the abyss's influence grew stronger. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive, and the whispers had become a constant, insidious presence. In the crew quarters, Kelly sat alone on her bunk, her hands trembling. She stared at the wall in front of her, where the symbols had reappeared, glowing faintly in the dim light. "They're watching us," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "What are you talking about?" one of the remaining sailors asked, his tone sharp. Kelly turned to him, her eyes wide and unblinking. "The ones who came before. They're still here. I can see them." The sailor backed away, his face pale. "You're not making sense." But Kelly wasn't listening. She pointed to the corner of the room, where a faint, translucent figure had begun to take shape. It was humanoid but distorted, its features twisted as though melted by an unseen force. "Do you see it?" she whispered, her voice rising in pitch. "It's right there." The figure turned its head, its hollow eyes locking onto Kelly. She screamed, her voice echoing through the submarine as the lights flickered and died. When the lights returned, Kelly was gone. The entity's true nature. In the control room, Warren and Hughes pored over the remaining logs, trying to make sense of the symbols that had appeared throughout the submarine. "It's a language," Hughes said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But it's not like anything we've ever seen. It's more primal, like it's speaking directly to the mind." Warren studied the patterns, his jaw tightening. "It's trying to tell us something," he said. "Or drive us mad," Hughes muttered. As they worked, the rhythmic pulse grew louder, resonating through the walls like a drumbeat. Warren felt his vision blur, and for a moment, he wasn't in the control room anymore. He was back in the abyss. The darkness stretched endlessly around him, punctuated by faint, glowing shapes that moved like living shadows. The entity's voice filled the void, deep and resonant. "You cannot resist," it said. "You are mine." Warren tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The glowing shapes coalesced into forms, humanoid figures, their faces twisted in agony. They reached for him, their mouths moving silently as if begging for release. "Who are you?" Warren demanded, his voice finally breaking through. The entity's glowing eye appeared, immense and all-encompassing. "We are the abyss," it said. "We are the beginning and the end. And now, you are part of us. The final plan." Warren snapped back to reality, gasping for breath. Hughes was beside him, her face etched with concern. "Commander, are you all right?" she asked. He nodded, though his hands were trembling. It's not just following us, he said. It's consuming us, piece by piece. If we don't stop it, we'll all be gone. How? Hughes asked. We're out of options. Warren hesitated, then made his decision. We still have the emergency beacon. If we overload it, we might be able to create a pulse strong enough to disrupt the entity's influence. Hughes frowned. That could destroy the submarine. We're already dead if we do nothing, Warren said. This is our last shot. The beacon overload. The crew gathered in the communications bay, their numbers reduced to just a handful. Warren and Hughes worked quickly, rerouting power to the emergency beacon and setting it to emit a focused pulse. As they worked, the submarine began to tremble. The shadows thickened, and the whispers grew deafening, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. It knows what we're doing, Hughes said, her voice shaking. Then we'd better move faster, Warren replied. The entity's voice returned, louder and more powerful than ever. You cannot defy me, it roared. You will become one with the abyss. The walls of the submarine began to twist and warp as the entity's presence grew overwhelming. The lights flickered, and the symbols on the walls burned brightly, filling the room with an eerie glow. Almost there, Hughes said, her fingers flying over the controls. Hurry! Warren shouted. The beacon began to emit a low hum as it charged, the energy building to a critical point. The entity's voice rose in pitch, a furious roar that shook the entire vessel. Now! Warren yelled. Hughes slammed her hand down on the final switch, and the beacon unleashed a blinding pulse of energy. The aftermath. The pulse ripped through the submarine and into the surrounding void. The entity's voice faltered, then dissolved into a deafening silence. The shadows receded, and the rhythmic pulse finally ceased. The crew collapsed to the floor, their ears ringing and their bodies trembling. For the first time in days, there was quiet. Did it work? Hughes asked, her voice barely audible. Warren stared at the now dormant beacon, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. I think so, he said. But as the surviving crew members looked around the battered submarine, a chilling thought lingered in their minds. Had they truly escaped the abyss? Or had it simply retreated, waiting for its chance to return? The USS Sablefish floated silently on the surface of the North Atlantic, battered but intact. The survivors, Commander Warren, Hughes, and 2 remaining sailors, sat in the control room, their faces etched with exhaustion. The emergency beacon's energy pulse had silenced the entity's presence, but the atmosphere aboard was far from calm. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the submarine was quiet. No whispers, no pulsing rhythm, no shadows creeping along the walls. And yet, the silence felt unnatural, ominous, as though the abyss was still watching. Systems are fried, Hughes said, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't send a distress signal, and we're dead in the water. We'll drift until someone finds us, if they ever do. Warren nodded, his gaze fixed on the blank sonar screen. It's not over, he said quietly. Hughes frowned. The pulse worked, didn't it? The entity's gone. Warren's expression darkened. Gone doesn't mean dead. It was too vast, too ancient. We didn't destroy it, we just drove it away. For now. The waiting game. Over the next several hours, the crew tried to repair what little they could. The submarine was in shambles, with most compartments inaccessible and power reserves dwindling. The survivors rationed their remaining food and water, knowing it could be days, or weeks, before help arrived. In the mess hall, the sailors sat in silence, too tired and too afraid to speak. Do you think it's really over? One of them asked finally. Hughes hesitated before answering. We're still here, aren't we? Yeah, the sailor replied. But for how long? The room fell silent again, the weight of the question hanging over them. Signs of the abyss. By the second day, the survivors began to notice subtle changes. At first, it was small things, a faint vibration in the walls, the distant echo of a sound that couldn't be placed. Then came the condensation, thin streaks of moisture forming symbols on the bulkheads, just as they had before. Warren stood in the control room, staring at the strange markings that now adorned the walls. "Hughes," he called, his voice low. She approached cautiously, her eyes widening as she saw the symbols. "No," she whispered. "This can't be happening." "It never left," Warren said, his voice grim. "It's still here. It's part of the ship now, part of us." Hughes shook her head. "There has to be something we can do. Some way to fight it." "Fighting it only delays the inevitable," Warren said. "The abyss doesn't just consume, it becomes. And once it touches you, it never lets go." The final night. That night, the submarine's lights flickered for the last time and went dark. The survivors huddled together in the control room, their flashlights casting faint beams across the walls. "We have to stay awake," Hughes said, her voice trembling. "If we fall asleep, it'll take us." The sailors nodded, but their exhaustion was evident. Days of fear and chaos had taken their toll, and the oppressive darkness seemed to sap their remaining strength. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the submarine's hull. The rhythmic pulse was faint now, but still present, a haunting reminder of the abyss's grip. One by one, the survivors succumbed to sleep. The abyss claims its own. Warren woke to the sound of whispers. They were soft at first, like a distant wind, but they grew louder with every passing second. He opened his eyes and found himself alone in the control room. "Hughes," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response. He stood, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were covered in symbols, their faint glow illuminating the room in a sickly light. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single voice, the entity's voice. "You thought you could escape," it said, its tone calm and resonant. "But the abyss is eternal. It is part of you now." Warren turned, his heart pounding, and saw the glowing eye of the entity materialize before him. It was impossibly large, filling the entire room with its gaze. "What do you want?" Warren demanded, his voice shaking. "To consume," the entity replied. "To endure. You are vessels, and through you, we remain." A final act of defiance. Warren clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had fought too hard to let the abyss take him now. He moved to the control panel, his flashlight illuminating the emergency beacon's controls. The system was damaged, but it still had power, a faint glimmer of hope in the darkness. "If you're going to take me," Warren said, his voice steady, "I'm taking you with me." The entity's eye narrowed, its voice growing colder. "You cannot destroy what is infinite." "Maybe not," Warren replied. "But I can make you regret ever finding us." With a final surge of determination, he activated the beacon, overloading it with what little power remained. The submarine shuddered violently as the pulse began to build, the energy crackling through the air. The entity roared, its voice a deafening cacophony that shook the walls. The symbols on the bulkheads burned brightly, then dissolved into nothingness as the pulse reached its peak. The end of the Sablefish. The explosion tore through the USS Sablefish, its energy ripping apart the submarine and sending a shockwave through the surrounding ocean. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the abyss receded, its presence fading into the void. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the Sablefish, only the faint echo of its final act of defiance, carried on the currents of the North Atlantic. Epilogue: The Abyss Watches. Months later, a fishing trawler off the coast of Greenland reported finding strange debris floating on the water. Twisted shards of metal and fragments of hull plating, scorched and unrecognizable, were hauled aboard. Among the wreckage was a single object, a small, intact section of the Sablefish's control panel. Etched into the surface, faint but unmistakable, were the same alien symbols that had haunted the crew. As the trawler sailed away, the ocean beneath it grew unnaturally still. And far below, in the depths of the abyss, something ancient stirred once more. The abyss was patient. And it was waiting.